The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets of Vancouver. Keanu Reeves stepped out of his car, taking a deep breath as he stared up at the familiar silhouette of his old high school. It had been decades since he last walked these halls, and yet, in that moment, the memories felt as vivid as ever: the laughter of classmates, the sharp ring of the school bell, the rush of sneakers scuffing against tiled floors. Tonight was meant to be a simple visit, just another guest appearance at a charity event aimed at raising funds for underprivileged students. No cameras, no press, just Keanu reconnecting with a place that had once shaped him. He walked through the dimly lit corridors, his boots echoing against the linoleum, lost in the nostalgia of his teenage years. But then, something made him stop. At the far end of the hallway, a lone figure moved with slow, deliberate steps. A mop glided across the floor, a bucket rolled softly beside him. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting elongated shadows. Keanu narrowed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. There was something eerily familiar about the way the man held himself, the way his body bent ever so slightly as he worked. As he stepped closer, his heart pounded. The man turned, and in that instant, time seemed to collapse. Mr. Harris. His hair, once dark, had faded to silver. Deep lines traced his weathered face. But the eyes, those kind, watchful eyes, were unmistakable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then, recognition dawned. "Keanu?" the old man whispered, his voice rough with age but warm with something else, something Keanu hadn't even realized he had been missing. Keanu Reeves stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the man before him. Mr. Harris. It had been decades since he last saw him, yet time had done little to erode the quiet strength in the old janitor's posture. His uniform was clean but worn, his hair now a stark white, and his movements slower, more deliberate. But the look in his eyes, the same quiet understanding, the same depth, hadn't changed at all. A wave of emotions crashed over Keanu, pulling him back to a time when he was just another lost kid in these very hallways. He had always known Mr. Harris as a quiet presence, someone who existed in the background, never drawing attention to himself, but always there. He wasn't just the man who cleaned the floors, he was the one who noticed things others didn't. The one who saw the students who felt invisible. And Keanu had been one of them. The memories came rushing in, sharp and unfiltered. A teenage Keanu, slumped on the gymnasium bleachers, staring at the scuffed floor beneath his sneakers. It had been a rough day. A failed test, a frustrated coach, tension at home, too many things weighing him down. He had planned to sit there in silence until the hallways emptied, until he could pretend none of it mattered. But then, the sound of slow, measured footsteps approached. A shadow fell over him. "Tough day?" a rough yet gentle voice asked. Keanu didn't look up. He just nodded. Mr. Harris didn't push. He simply sat down beside him, setting his mop bucket aside. There was no lecture, no forced advice, just quiet understanding. And then, after a moment, he spoke. "You know, people think I just clean floors," he said with a soft chuckle. "But I see everything. I see kids who think no one notices them. I see the ones who fight battles no one else knows about." Keanu had finally glanced up, confused. "You're not as invisible as you think, kid." At the time, those words had barely registered. He had nodded, muttered some kind of thanks, and gone about his day. But standing here now, looking at the man who had spoken them all those years ago, Keanu realized how much they had mattered. Mr. Harris had seen him before Keanu had even known how much he needed to be seen. Keanu swallowed hard, his throat tightening. The years had changed so much, yet in this moment, it was as if no time had passed at all. "It's been a long time," he finally said, his voice softer than he intended. Mr. Harris gave a slow nod, his gaze drifting over Keanu like he was seeing both the past and the present at once. "A very long time." There was a pause, thick with unspoken understanding. And for the first time in years, Keanu felt like that kid again, the one sitting in the gym, tired, uncertain, but not invisible. Never invisible. Keanu Reeves had always been known for his ability to sense when something wasn't right. And as he stood in that dimly lit hallway, staring at Mr. Harris, that feeling gnawed at him with a quiet persistence. At first glance, the old janitor still looked like the man Keanu remembered, the same composed presence, the same humble demeanor. But now, standing here as an adult, Keanu saw more. He noticed the exhaustion in Mr. Harris's posture, the way his shoulders sagged ever so slightly under the weight of the years. He saw the stiffness in his movements, the way he favored one leg, shifting uncomfortably every few seconds. The slow tremor in his fingers as they gripped the mop handle. And then there was the uniform. It was clean but old, the fabric thinned by time, the edges frayed just enough to reveal years of labor. Keanu's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a man who chose to keep working because he loved the job. This was a man who had no other choice. Clearing his throat, Keanu forced a smile. "I never expected to find you here after all these years." Mr. Harris chuckled, shaking his head. "I never left." The words were spoken lightly, but Keanu caught something beneath them. A quiet resignation. His gaze flicked down to the mop bucket, to the ID badge clipped onto Mr. Harris's chest. This wasn't some part-time work to pass the time. This was survival. Keanu took a step closer. "Are you still working full-time?" There was a brief hesitation before Mr. Harris gave a small nod. "Work keeps me moving, you know how it is." That wasn't an answer. That was deflection. Keanu studied him, his sharp eyes catching every detail, the slight wince as he adjusted his weight, the way his fingers flexed like they ached. This wasn't just the wear of old age. This was exhaustion. This was a man who had spent a lifetime giving everything to a place that had long stopped giving anything back. An unsettling realization crept up Keanu's spine. Why was an 80-year-old man still scrubbing floors? He wanted to ask more, to push, but something in Mr. Harris's expression stopped him. Pride. A quiet dignity that had kept him moving for decades. But Keanu wasn't one to let things go. That night, sitting in his Los Angeles home, he couldn't shake the image of Mr. Harris from his mind. The weary smile. The hunched posture. The quiet way he had accepted his reality, as if this was simply the way things had to be. It didn't sit right with him. Pulling out his phone, Keanu started making calls. He needed answers. And what he found only made his stomach turn. Retirement for school janitors wasn't what most people thought. The pensions were low, shockingly low. Most janitors barely scraped by, and in cities where the cost of living had skyrocketed, many couldn't afford to stop working. Rent, medical bills, basic necessities, it was a battle just to stay afloat. And Mr. Harris? He had no family left. His wife had passed years ago. No children. No one to help. It was just him now, waking up every morning, putting on that old uniform, and returning to the same hallways he had cleaned for decades. Keanu clenched his fists. This man had spent his life serving others, quietly keeping a school running, watching over generations of students, including Keanu himself. And yet, in the end, society had given him nothing. It wasn't just unfair. It was infuriating. And suddenly, Keanu knew, he had to do something. But how could he help without making Mr. Harris feel like a charity case? That was the question that kept him up that night. Keanu Reeves sat alone in his dimly lit living room, his mind restless, thoughts swirling like a storm he couldn't quiet. The city lights of Los Angeles flickered beyond the glass windows, but his focus was elsewhere, back in Vancouver, back in the quiet, empty hallways of his old high school, back to the moment he saw Mr. Harris still pushing that mop, still working when he should have been resting. It wasn't just the exhaustion in Mr. Harris's movements that haunted him, it was the look in his eyes. That quiet, resigned acceptance of his reality. He wasn't still working because he wanted to. He was working because he had no other choice. Keanu clenched his jaw. He had seen this story before, good people slipping through the cracks, forgotten by a system that was supposed to protect them. But Mr. Harris wasn't just another statistic. He was the man who had once seen Keanu when he felt invisible, the man who had spoken words of encouragement when Keanu had been nothing more than a lost teenager trying to find his way. And now? Now it was Keanu's turn to see him. But how? Throwing money at the problem wasn't enough. A check could fix bills, but it wouldn't fix pride. Mr. Harris had spent his life working, earning his place in the world. He wouldn't accept charity, and Keanu knew that if he simply offered to pay for everything, Mr. Harris would refuse. No, this had to be something more. Keanu grabbed a notebook from the table, flipping to a blank page. He tapped the pen against the paper, thinking, before finally scribbling down a question. What if Mr. Harris didn't just retire? What if he became something bigger? The idea began to take shape. Mr. Harris had never been just a janitor. He had been a quiet mentor, a watchful presence, a man who had seen the kids that no one else noticed. What if that didn't have to end? What if, instead of working himself into the ground just to survive, he had a new role, one that gave him purpose and financial security? Keanu underlined the words. Life Lessons with Mr. Harris, a mentorship program. Instead of pushing a mop, Mr. Harris could teach students about resilience, about hard work, about life. He had decades of wisdom, stories that could inspire, lessons that weren't found in textbooks. The school didn't just need someone to clean its hallways, it needed someone to guide its students. Keanu sat back, running a hand through his hair. This was it. It wasn't charity. It was an opportunity. A real, paying job that would allow Mr. Harris to finally put down the mop without feeling like he was taking a handout. And Keanu would make sure that his first job requirement would be getting the knee surgery he desperately needed. But there was one problem left. Mr. Harris was proud. He wouldn't accept this unless he felt it was truly earned. Keanu exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. Fine. He'd just have to make sure Mr. Harris saw this for what it was, an opportunity, not a favor. The next morning, Keanu was on a flight back to Vancouver. When he arrived at the school, he didn't go through the front entrance where the event organizers had welcomed him the night before. Instead, he walked through the quiet side corridors, making his way to a small, tucked-away office near the maintenance wing. The janitor's closet. The door was slightly open. Inside, Mr. Harris sat at a tiny metal desk, threading a needle, slowly stitching a tear in his old uniform. His hands were steady, but Keanu could see the effort it took. Keanu knocked softly. Mr. Harris. The old man looked up, surprised to see him again. Back so soon? Keanu stepped inside, offering a small smile. Couldn't stop thinking about you. Mr. Harris chuckled, shaking his head. No need to worry about an old janitor like me, kid. But Keanu wasn't smiling anymore. He sat down across from him, watching as the elderly man carefully finished stitching the fabric. He knew that Mr. Harris wasn't the kind of man who complained, who asked for help, who let the weight of his struggles show. Which meant Keanu had to ask the questions that mattered. Why are you still working here, Mr. Harris? A heavy silence filled the small office. The old man exhaled slowly, setting the needle aside. Because I have no choice, son. Keanu's chest tightened. Your pension. Mr. Harris nodded. Not enough. Worked my whole life, but the little I get each month barely covers rent and food. The cost of living went up, but my income stayed the same. Keanu's jaw clenched. And your family? A shadow crossed Mr. Harris's face. He shook his head. No family left. My wife passed years ago. No kids. It's just me now. That hit harder than Keanu expected. No one should be alone like that. But there was more. Mr. Harris shifted slightly in his seat, wincing as he moved his leg. Keanu noticed. Your knee, he said quietly. You're in pain. Mr. Harris hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Doctor says I need surgery. But I can't afford to stop working. So I keep going. Keanu clenched his fists, the injustice of it all hitting him like a wave. This man had spent his entire life taking care of others, cleaning their hallways, keeping their schools running, making sure kids like Keanu felt seen. And yet, at nearly 80 years old, he was still scrubbing floors, still carrying the weight of it all, still pushing through pain because there was no other option. Keanu refused to accept that. This wasn't pity. It wasn't just sadness. It was anger. And it wasn't going to happen on his watch. He had a plan. And now, he just had to convince Mr. Harris to believe in it. Keanu Reeves had spent his life helping people, but he knew this was different. This wasn't just about writing a check or making a grand gesture, this was about giving Mr. Harris something he had spent his entire life giving to others, dignity. As he stood outside the janitor's closet, watching the old man carefully fold his tattered uniform, Keanu knew he had to get this right. This couldn't feel like charity. It had to be earned. Taking a deep breath, Keanu stepped forward. Mr. Harris, he said, his voice steady, your knee's not getting better. You know it. You need that surgery. The old man sighed, shaking his head. I told you, Keanu. I don't take handouts. Keanu had expected that. He had spent the entire night thinking about how to approach this moment. He wasn't going to let pride get in the way of giving this man the life he deserved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the desk between them. It's not a handout, Keanu said. It's a job requirement. Mr. Harris frowned, his tired eyes scanning Keanu's face before glancing down at the paper. What is this? He asked, unfolding it. Keanu leaned forward. A mentorship program. Life lessons with Mr. Harris. You won't be a janitor anymore. You'll be a mentor. You'll teach kids about hard work, about resilience, about life. But you can't do that limping around in pain. So, the surgery. It's part of your new job. Silence. Keanu watched as Mr. Harris traced his fingers over the printed words. His expression was unreadable, but Keanu could see the battle happening in his mind. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was a purpose. Finally, Mr. Harris exhaled slowly. And if I say no? Keanu smirked. Then I'll just keep coming back until you say yes. A pause. And then, for the first time that day, Mr. Harris chuckled, a deep, warm laugh that Keanu remembered from his youth. He shook his head, smiling just a little. You always were a stubborn kid, he muttered. Keanu grinned. Learn from the best. A second chance. Within weeks, everything changed. Keanu personally arranged for Mr. Harris to have his knee surgery at one of the best hospitals in the country. The moment the old man woke up from anesthesia, Keanu was there, arms crossed, smirking. Better heal fast, old man, he joked. The kids are waiting. Mr. Harris shook his head, still groggy. You don't quit, do you? Nope. Keanu made sure he had the best care, the best physical therapy, everything he needed. And when Mr. Harris was strong enough to return to the school, he didn't come back as a janitor. He came back as a mentor. Keanu had used his influence to turn the mentorship program into an official part of the school's curriculum. Students now had the chance to sit down with Mr. Harris, listen to his stories, learn from his experiences. And for the first time in decades, Mr. Harris wasn't cleaning floors, he was shaping lives. A legacy that will last. But Keanu wasn't done yet. One afternoon, he took Mr. Harris for a walk around the campus. The older man moved slower, but there was a new lightness in his steps. He was no longer carrying the weight of survival. Keanu stopped in front of a newly renovated building. Above the entrance, in bold letters, were the words, "The Harris Educational Center, a place for second chances." Mr. Harris stared at it for a long moment, his breath catching in his throat. His fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. "Keanu," his voice wavered. "You didn't have to do this." Keanu nudged him playfully. "No arguments. It's already built." Mr. Harris exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn." Keanu grinned. "Learn from the best." Inside the building, there were classrooms, study areas, and a space dedicated to mentorship and career guidance for underprivileged students. A place where kids who felt lost, just like Keanu once did, could come and find their path. A place where no one would ever feel invisible again. A final surprise. A few weeks later, Keanu met Mr. Harris at the airport. The old man stood near gate 32, gripping the handle of a small, worn suitcase. "You sure you're ready for this?" Keanu asked. Mr. Harris chuckled. "I spent my whole life making sure other people were okay. Maybe it's time I let someone take care of me for once." Keanu nodded. "Your brother is going to be happy to see you." A shadow of emotion crossed Mr. Harris's face. "I hope so. It's been 40 years." Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out something small and worn. He handed it to Mr. Harris. The old man's eyes widened. It was an old, tattered notebook. "I found this a long time ago," Mr. Harris murmured, his fingers tracing the edges. "You threw it away when you were a kid." "I held on to it." Keanu opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. His own handwriting, rushed and messy, filled the pages. His thoughts, his fears, his doubts. And then, on the last page, a sentence he had written as a teenager stopped him cold. "If I ever make it, I hope I never forget what it feels like to be lost. And if I can, I'll help someone else find their way." Keanu swallowed hard, looking up. "Why did you keep this?" Mr. Harris's eyes were steady. "Because even back then, I knew you were going to be someone great. And I wanted you to remember where you came from." Silence. Keanu exhaled, a lump forming in his throat. Because now, he understood. He had never been alone. And because of Mr. Harris, the next generation of kids who walked through that school never would be either. The airport was bustling with movement, a steady hum of voices filling the space. Travelers hurried past, rolling their suitcases behind them, boarding calls echoing through the overhead speakers. But in one quiet corner near gate 32, time seemed to slow. Keanu Reeves stood beside Mr. Harris, watching as the old man clutched the handle of his small, worn suitcase. His ticket was neatly tucked into his coat pocket, but his fingers grazed over it absent-mindedly, as if still trying to process the reality of it all. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't thinking about mop buckets or late-night shifts, about aching knees and long, empty hallways. He was thinking about his brother, the man he hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. Keanu studied him for a moment, noticing the way his grip on the suitcase tightened. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked gently. Mr. Harris let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "I spent my whole life making sure other people were okay," he murmured. "Maybe it's time I let someone take care of me for once." Keanu nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Your brother's going to be happy to see you." The old man swallowed hard, his voice softer now. "I hope so." A silence stretched between them, filled with all the unspoken words, the weight of years that had passed, the life that Mr. Harris had spent putting others before himself. Then, he turned to Keanu, his expression unreadable at first. But when he spoke, his voice carried something deeper, something Keanu had heard before, long ago, when he was just a lost teenager sitting on a gymnasium bench. "You've done a lot for me, kid," Mr. Harris said. "But you know something?" Keanu tilted his head. "What's that?" A small smile formed on the old man's lips. "You were always a good kid. I just helped you see it." Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat, the kind of emotion that didn't come with easy words. Instead, he just nodded, understanding exactly what Mr. Harris meant. The final boarding call rang through the airport. Mr. Harris exhaled, gripping Keanu's shoulder briefly, a firm but familiar touch, one that spoke of quiet gratitude, of unshaken respect. Then, with one last nod, he picked up his suitcase and disappeared through the gate, stepping into the next chapter of his life. Keanu stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the man who had once watched over him finally get the peace he deserved. Then, slowly, he pulled something from his jacket. The old notebook. The one Mr. Harris had saved for over 40 years. He flipped to the last page, his own teenage handwriting staring back at him. And there, scrawled in ink from a boy who once felt lost, were the words. "If I ever make it, I hope I never forget what it feels like to be lost. And if I can, I'll help someone else find their way." Keanu let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Because now he knew, he had never really been alone. And because of Mr. Harris, neither would the next generation of kids who walked through that school.